All right, so you're here with us on the deep dive because, let's face it, you want to efficiently understand those, really complex historical strategies.
Exactly.
And today we're diving into a pretty significant one,
Yeah.
Britain's long-standing balance of power.
Uh-huh.
Now, this wasn't just some political game they were playing. This was like a fundamental principle that guided their foreign policy for centuries.
Right. Centuries.
And it all boiled down to preventing any single power from becoming like the big boss on the European playground.
Yeah. Dominating the European landscape.
Exactly,
Boy,
dominating.
okay.
So to really unpack this, we're going to be using Perfide Albion, Britain's balance of power, as our guide for this deep
Yeah.
dive.
Good source.
It gives a really great historical rundown of this strategy.
Yeah.
And our mission today is to pull out those core insights
Uh-huh.
and like the key historical examples that show us,
Yeah.
how it was actually put into practice and how it evolved over time.
Right. Exactly how it worked and changed.
So let's start at square one. What were the initial drivers and how did this strategy first show up?
Well, you can trace the origins of Britain's balance of power strategy back to the late 15th century,
Hmm.
as England was, really becoming a more prominent European power.
Right.
And the main motivation was really simple.
Yeah.
They needed to stop any single state from gaining too much power on the continent.
Makes sense.
Because if one country got too strong, it would directly threaten England's own security and their trade interests.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
This wasn't about being nice or anything. It was about protecting their own interests.
So a very pragmatic approach.
Yeah, exactly. A calculated move to benefit themselves.
That's interesting.
And we see early examples of this principle in action.
Oh, really? Like what?
We'll take the Anglo-Portuguese Treaty of 1373.
Okay.
That's a great example of a lasting alliance that was formed to counter a specific threat.
Okay.
In this case, the power of Castile.
So they teamed up to keep Castile in check.
Yeah, pretty much. And what's really remarkable about this treaty is how long it lasted.
Yeah.
It's actually the oldest active alliance in the world.
Wow.
And it proved its importance centuries later during the Napoleonic Wars and even World War II.
You're kidding.
Nope, Britain was able to use the Azores because of this treaty.
Wow. So these balancing acts can have a really long-lasting impact.
Definitely they can shape events for generations.
All right. So moving on to the 18th century. It seems like this balance of power strategy became even more refined.
Yeah, you could say that.
Like they were really actively pursuing
They
it.
were getting pretty good at it.
And the War of the Spanish Succession
Yeah.
from 1702 to 1714.
Uh-huh.
That's a really clear example of this in action.
Right, it is a classic case study.
Britain teamed up with Austria and the Dutch Republic
Yeah, the big three.
to stop France and Spain from uniting under the Bourbon dynasty.
Did not want to see that happen.
So why was this union such a big deal for Britain?
Well, think about it. A combined Franco-Spanish superpower. That would have been a huge shift in the European power structure.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
It would have been a direct challenge to Britain's maritime ambitions and their ability to project power overseas.
So it would mess with their economic and strategic goals.
Exactly. It would jeopardize everything they were working towards.
Hmm.
And the Treaty of Utrecht in 1713, which ended the war, that was really important because it cemented Britain's position as a major player in European politics.
I see.
They made sure power was distributed in a way that prevented any one country from dominating the continent.
So they were shaping the whole game.
They were becoming the masters of the balance.
And the key takeaway here is that Britain was really prioritizing its economic and maritime interests.
Yeah?
Even if it meant siding with old rivals
Yeah.
to prevent like a super powerful entity.
They were pragmatic about it. They knew what they needed to do.
Makes sense.
Now, the 18th century saw a lot of major conflicts in Europe.
Yeah, it was a pretty turbulent time.
How did the balance of power play out in events like the War of the Austrian Succession and the 7 Years' War?
Right, so how did this principle show up in those wars?
Well, both of those wars, the War of the Austrian Succession from 1740 to 1748,
Okay.
and the 7 Years' War from 1756 to 1763, they really highlight Britain's commitment to maintaining that balance of power.
They weren't letting their guard down.
Not at all.
Interesting.
And in the 7 Years' War, Britain actually supported Prussia
Yeah.
against France and Austria.
So they were playing both sides.
Well, they were strategically choosing their allies based on who posed the bigger threat.
I see.
It's important to note how they used their resources.
Right.
They used their financial strength to support their allies on the continent,
Here.
and they used their powerful navy to protect their interests around the world.
Smart.
Very smart.
Hmm.
Now, the outcome of that war, it solidified Britain's global dominance,
Yeah.
but it also maybe created some future problems because it tilted the balance in their favor.
Oh, so it made them too powerful in a way.
You could say that, and, other European powers eventually wanted to address that.
That makes sense. So the Napoleonic era was like the ultimate test of this balance of power strategy.
Yeah, it was like the strategy in full force.
Because Napoleon was a serious threat.
A huge threat.
Exactly. He wanted to rule all of Europe.
He had some ambitious plans.
And Britain had to respond.
And they had a multi-pronged approach.
Okay, what did they do?
First, they funded those coalitions on the continent.
So they were bankrolling the resistance against Napoleon?
Basically, yes.
Mm.
Then they had their navy blockade France.
Oh, yeah, to weaken them.
Exactly, to cut off their supplies and trade.
Smart move.
It was.
And ultimately, they played a big role in the Congress of Vienna in 1815.
Right, they were key players at the negotiating table.
And the goal of that Congress was to restore the balance of power in Europe.
Absolutely. That was the main objective.
Okay.
They wanted to create a lasting peace by setting up a system with 5 major powers.
So like a power-sharing arrangement.
Exactly. Britain, France, Russia, Austria, and Prussia.
Okay.
The idea was that these powers would keep each other in check.
Yeah, no one could get too powerful again.
That was the hope they wanted to prevent another Napoleon situation.
So it was a deliberate attempt to create a stable multipolar system.
Right, a system where power was distributed among multiple players.
That's fascinating.
Now, as we move into the later 19th century, a major event shook things up.
And that was the unification of Germany in 1871.
A game changer.
A game changer for sure. So how did this disrupt the balance?
Well, up until then, Britain had benefited from a pretty fragmented Central Europe.
All right.
Lots of smaller states, not one big power.
Yeah.
But then you have a unified Germany,
Right.
industrialized, militarized, a major force on the continent.
It was a new reality.
And it really challenged Britain's traditional balancing act.
So their old playbook wasn't working anymore.
And as well, the existing mechanisms and alliances, they weren't enough to smoothly integrate this new power. And this ultimately contributed to the formation of those rigid alliance blocks.
Yeah, the Triple Alliance and the Triple Entente.
Right, those blocks were a sign of trouble.
Because they made things less flexible.
Yeah, and more prone to confrontation.
And those blocks ultimately failed to prevent World War I.
Tragically, yes.
Britain was initially hesitant to fully commit to an alliance.
They like to keep their options open.
Right, but they eventually joined the Triple Entente.
With France and Russia.
To counter Germany's growing power.
Yeah, they had to make a choice.
But the scale of World War I?
The devastation.
It really showed that the old balance of power system wasn't enough to maintain peace in the face of such massive shifts in power.
It was a wake-up call. The system was broken.
And then the peace settlements after the war, like the Treaty of Versailles, they didn't really create a lasting balance either.
They had their flaws, for sure.
And that contributed to the conditions that led to World War II.
It's a complex chain of events, but the treaty definitely played a role.
So after the 2 world wars, the global landscape was completely different.
Yeah, the world had changed dramatically.
How did Britain's approach to the balance of power evolve in the 20th century and beyond?
Well, the Cold War marked a fundamental shift. The main balance of power struggle. It went from being a mostly European issue to a global standoff between the United States and the Soviet Union.
To 2 superpowers.
Exactly, each representing a pole of power.
And Britain sided with the U.S.?
Yeah, firmly. They became a key member of NATO.
The North Atlantic Treaty Organization.
Yeah.
So their role changed.
It did.
They went from being like an independent balancer in Europe to being part of a bigger Western alliance.
Yeah, they joined forces to contain Soviet influence.
And it's interesting to think about the Anglo-Japanese alliance from 1902 to 1923 as an early example of Britain partnering with countries outside of Europe.
They were willing to look beyond Europe when it served their interests.
So they were adaptable.
Yeah, they were always adjusting to the changing landscape.
But the source also points out some criticisms of this balance of power strategy.
It wasn't without its flaws.
So what are the main arguments against it?
Well, critics say that while the balance of power might have benefited Britain, it often made things unstable and led to conflict in Europe.
So it was a double-edged sword.
In a way, yes.
Hmm.
Constantly shifting alliances and trying to contain rising powers
Right.
that could create suspicion and distrust
Yeah.
and potentially lead to war.
And some would argue that's what happened with the rigid alliances that preceded World War I.
That's a common criticism.
And then there's the policy of appeasement towards Nazi Germany in the 1930s.
Right.
That's often seen as a failure of balancing principles.
Yeah. The attempt to accommodate Hitler backfired.
So instead of containing him, they emboldened him.
It's a cautionary tale about the limits of appeasement.
So despite these criticisms, the idea of stopping any one country from becoming too powerful,
Yeah.
that seems pretty relevant today.
It's still a major concern in international relations. The specific methods might have changed,
Right.
but the core principle of preventing unchecked dominance,
That's still important.
it's evident in modern alliances like NATO
Okay.
and in economic partnerships that try to counter the influence of certain countries,
Right.
and in diplomatic coalitions formed to tackle global issues.
So it's still all about preventing one player from calling all the shots.
Yeah. In essence, it's about maintaining a balance of power
And that idea of a multipolar world.
with multiple centers of power.
That's kind of a modern expression of this age-old concern.
It is. It's about ensuring that no single entity can dominate the global stage.
So to sum up Britain's balance of power strategy,
Yeah.
it was all about being pragmatic and adaptable.
Mm-hmm.
They were constantly shifting their alliances and reacting to changes in the power dynamics.
Right. They had to be flexible.
And they played a huge role in shaping global history
They did.
by always trying to prevent the rise of a dominant power in Europe.
That was their mission.
And when it worked, it led to periods of stability in Europe.
Yeah.
But when it failed, it often led to conflict.
It's a complex legacy.
And it highlights the challenges of maintaining balance in a world where international relations are constantly shifting.
It's a constant struggle for equilibrium.
Absolutely.
So here's something for you to think about.
Yeah.
Considering what we've learned about Britain's balance of power strategy,
Uh-huh.
how might this principle be applied or maybe even challenged in today's world?
Right.
It's a world with new global powers emerging and complex interdependencies.
A very different world than the one Britain navigated.
Very different.
So how do we apply these historical lessons to the 21st century?
It's a question worth pondering.
It definitely is.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.
And thanks for listening.